There is significant fury coming from President Trump following the most recent ruling in the James Comey case. He's asserted publicly that the situation reeks of favoritism, that the same institutional actors who pursued him for years are now being quietly protected. And while that legal drama unfolds in Washington, a political bombshell has just detonated in California. 5 senior officials, all closely tied to Governor Gavin Newsom's administration, including his former chief of staff, have been arrested in a massive corruption scandal involving luxury trips, backdated contracts, and laundered political funds. We are presented with 2 distinct data points, 2 bug reports, one an allegation of justice being bent, the other power being abused. Viewing these through a partisan lens is a low-resolution analysis. The real question is to unpack what is actually going on, because these stories are symptoms of the same underlying systemic disease. Think about the architecture of what we are witnessing. On one coast, you have a judge handling the prosecution of James Comey, a man who was, for years, at the center of the investigations into Trump. That judge is now facing profound questions about whether the process itself has been compromised. On the other coast, you have one of the nation's most powerful governors watching his inner circle get arrested for the kind of brazen, old-fashioned graft we were told had gone out of style, wire fraud, money laundering, backdated contracts. What connects these 2 points? It is not geography. It is not fundamentally party politics. It is something deeper. It is the core question of our entire system: who gets accountability and who gets protection. It is a question of whether the rules, as written, apply equally to all citizens, or whether they are, in fact, variables that bend and warp depending on your connections, your status, your utility to the people in charge. Let's begin with the fury from Trump, because to understand the reaction is to understand why millions of Americans feel a deep systemic unease. When reports circulated about irregularities in the Comey case, questions about evidence, procedural urges himself. But instead of a straightforward prosecution, the case is mired in procedural controversy. Defense lawyers are arguing, forcefully, that government evidence may be tainted. And then there is the matter of the grand jury. This is where it becomes deeply troubling. According to reports from court filings, when prosecutors first presented their case, the grand jury declined to indict, they returned a no bill, they concluded there was insufficient evidence. In a normal operating procedure, fidelity, whispers of improper access to privileged attorney-client communications, Trump called it what it looked like to him, corruption protecting its own, and whether you support him or not, his point resonates with a vast number of people watching a different set of rules in play. Here's what has been reported. Comey, the man who opened investigations into Trump, who memorialized their conversations, who became a central figure in political warfare, is now facing that should have been the end, but it wasn't. The prosecutor, reportedly, did not accept that answer. Instead, she kept the grand jurors there for hours, representing evidence, reframing arguments, until finally, by a narrow margin, an indictment was secured. Now, is that illegal? Not necessarily. Prosecutors have wide latitude, but is it ethical? Does it look like a dispassionate pursuit of justice? Or does it look like an operator determined to achieve a specific, predetermined outcome? And the more important question, do you believe, for 1 second, that Donald Trump would have been afforded that same level of persistence if the roles were reversed? For millions, this feels like déjà vu. It is the same pattern. When investigations target Trump or his associates, every aggressive tactic is justified. Pre-dawn raids, leaked information, charges piled high. But when an individual from the other side faces scrutiny, suddenly the system becomes deeply concerned with fairness, with process, with the danger of being too harsh. The emotional weight of this perceived disparity cannot be overstated. It is corrosive. It's why many feel, as one person wrote, old and tired. The anger is exhausting because it stems from a feeling of powerlessness against a system with admin privileges for some and user-level restrictions for everyone else. Trump's anger is not just about one man. It's not about Comey. It is about what this case represents. The idea of a protected class in Washington, people who can bend rules, weaponize their positions, and never truly face consequences. Because even when charges are filed, there is always a procedural question, a technicality, a sympathetic judge willing to slow things down. That's the frustration. That is the core of the bug report. But that frustration, as vivid as it is, points to something even larger. Because while Washington argues over the process of justice, California has just delivered a stark, unambiguous reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked and corruption becomes routine. The irony here is almost cinematic. Governor Gavin Newsom was recently abroad, enjoying diplomatic appearances in Brazil. He used that platform to criticize the Trump administration, calling it the most corrupt in American history. Strong words, bold words. Except there was one significant problem. While Governor Newsom was making those precise accusations, back home in California, federal agents were arresting 5 individuals intimately tied to his administration. This includes his longtime former chief of staff, Dana Williamson. This is not a low-level functionary. This is effectively the second most powerful position in California state government. And look at the substance of the charges. We are not in the gray area of procedural fairness anymore. We are in the black and white domain of felony. 23 criminal charges. Wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to defraud the government, obstruction of justice, filing false tax returns, lying to federal investigators. This was himself has not been charged with anything. His office quickly issued the standard political damage control you would expect. Williamson no longer works for the administration. The governor expects all public servants to uphold the highest standards of integrity, but the optics are devastating. Let's talk about what allegedly happened here, because the details matter. They are the diagnostic data, according to federal prosecutors Dana Williamson, not some minor ethics violation. This was old school brass knuckle corruption, the kind where you allegedly take hundreds of thousands of dollars from dormant political campaign accounts and funnel it into personal luxuries. And then you allegedly create fake contracts and backdate paperwork to cover your tracks. The governor on foreign soil calls someone else corrupt while his own house is collapsing. Now, to be fair, Governor Newsom ran Newsom's administration, helped orchestrate a scheme to divert around $200,000 from an inactive political campaign fund. This wasn't some forgotten account. This was active during the period from early 2022 through late 2024, which means, critically, it was allegedly happening while Williamson was still serving in the Newsom administration. And where did the money go? It went toward what prosecutors describe as a lavish lifestyle. Private jet flights, luxury hotel stays, high-end home furnishings, designer handbags. All of this was allegedly disguised as legitimate business expenses through carefully constructed and, in some cases, backdated contracts designed specifically to make it look legal. This is mens rea. This is intent. They set up a money laundering scheme where funds move through multiple accounts to obscure their real destination. But there's more. Prosecutors say that when federal investigators started looking into Paycheck Protection Program, TPP, loans made to a business Williamson owned, she allegedly backdated contracts again to thwart the FBI's investigation. Then, when it came time to file tax returns, she allegedly deducted these luxury purchases as if they were ordinary business expenses. This is not a gray area. That is fraud. And perhaps the most troubling detail, Williamson also allegedly created no-show jobs where associates were put on payroll but did no actual work. One person's spouse was paid a salary despite providing no services. This is the kind of graft you read about in history books. This is Tammany Hall, except it was allegedly happening in 2023 and 2024 in the nation's most populous state. And this is where the two stories, the Comey case and the Newsom arrest, reveal their common underlying thread. In both situations, you have people who presented themselves as guardians of integrity, as figures standing up for justice, who then become entangled in serious allegations of wrongdoing. And in both situations, you see a system that seems to apply different standards depending on who you are. Comey positioned himself as the straight arrow, yet his handling of investigations raised questions about bias. Now he faces concerns of preferential treatment. Williamson worked for a governor who constantly lectures about ethics, yet prosecutors allege she was running a corruption operation. And the response from the governor's office? Carefully worded statements. No outrage, no accountability, just political survival mode. This is what drives people crazy. This is what Trump taps into when he talks about a rigged system. It's not that corruption never gets prosecuted. Clearly, as the California arrests show, sometimes it does. It's that the process feels selective. It feels inconsistent. It feels shaped more by political considerations than by blind justice. When someone useful to the establishment faces trouble, the system slows. When someone threatening to the establishment faces trouble, the system moves with startling speed. Now you might be thinking, if the system is so protective, how did these arrests in California happen at all? How did these officials end up in handcuffs? That is a fair question, and the answer tells us something deeply important. The arrests happened, it appears, because the investigation started years ago, and because there are still some prosecutors and investigators who take their oaths seriously, regardless of political implications. They saw evidence of wrongdoing, and they pursued it. That is what is supposed to happen. But the very fact that it feels remarkable, the fact that we are almost surprised when powerful people face real consequences, that tells you how far things have drifted from the ideal. The exception highlights the rule. There are still people inside the Department of Justice who believe in doing their jobs, but those people are, by many accounts, increasingly uncomfortable. Reports have been surfacing for months about career prosecutors resigning rather than participate in what they consider to be politicized investigations, not just in one office, but across multiple districts. Some of these resignations reportedly happened in Florida, where prosecutors allegedly felt they were being asked to cross ethical lines in cases related to Trump. This is what instability inside the justice system looks like when career professionals start quitting rather than compromise their ethics. Those are all signs that something has gone wrong. The system is bending under political pressure, and the people inside it know it. And it's not limited to prosecutors. There are reports of judges, people appointed to lifetime positions who are stepping down, Reagan-appointed judges, people who have served for decades, and they are choosing to leave the bench rather than be complicit in what they view as the politicization of justice. Think about what that means. These are experienced legal professionals who understand that justice is rarely simple, and they are walking away because something about this current moment feels different. It feels worse. It feels like a line is being crossed that cannot be uncrossed. This institutional crisis is the cumulative effect of years of erosion, norms violated, precedents ignored. It creates a feedback loop. When good people leave, the institutions become more vulnerable, which causes more good people to leave. Meanwhile, back in California, the fallout from the Newsom-connected arrests is intersecting with other controversies. Just yesterday, California's Department of Motor Vehicles announced it was canceling more than 15,000 commercial driver's licenses that had been issued improperly. These are not regular licenses. These are CDLs, the kind you need to operate 80,000-pound big rigs, semi-trucks, school buses. According to the Federal Department of Transportation, California officials admitted these licenses had been issued illegally. The Transportation Secretary stated that California had been caught red-handed after weeks of denial, and that the 15,000 canceled licenses were just the tip of the iceberg. And this is not an abstract problem. One CDL holder wrote to me, "We have been complaining for years about these issues of dangerous drivers. They have made the whole industry look bad." He was right. The bug reports were being filed by the users, and the system ignored them. Why does this matter? Because it is the exact same pattern. Rules being bent or ignored by officials who think their political objectives justify cutting corners. And the consequences are not abstract. They are measured in lives. There have been multiple fatal accidents in recent months involving commercial vehicles driven by people who had no business operating them. One case involved a driver whose license listed his first name as no name given, literally, on an official state-issued real ID. How does that happen? The only answer is systemic dysfunction, either through incompetence or through a deliberate disregard for rules. Either way, regular people pay the price when those trucks crash on highways where your family might be traveling. This is what institutional corruption looks like in practice. It's not always briefcases of cash. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to ignore rules, to process paperwork without verification, to prioritize political goals over public safety. And it accumulates until you have a system where no one knows who is actually qualified, who has been vetted, and who slipped through because asking too many questions became inconvenient. This erosion feels deeply personal. You remember when a driver's license meant something, when political corruption was met with resignations, not PR strategies. The disconnect between that remembered reality and the present creates a profound sense of loss. Loss of the shared standards that make a complex society function. When rules become optional for some and strictly enforced for others, the entire foundation cracks. And this is exactly where the message of a rigged system gains its momentum. It resonates because people can see the evidence. They see the dual justice system. They see the corruption in California. They see the incompetence at the DMV. They see the double standards, and they are exhausted by the hypocrisy. Trump uses both of these scandals to reinforce that narrative. He points to the gentle handling Comey receives and contrasts it with the aggressive prosecution his own associates faced. He points to Newsom calling his administration corrupt, while Newsom's own chief of staff stands accused of actual old-fashioned graft. The irony is potent, and that message is landing, not just with his base, but with people who are so tired of the establishment's dishonesty that they are willing to overlook his flaws. Because at least he is naming the problem. This is how trust collapses. When people lose faith that institutions will treat them fairly, when they see their own struggles like that of the CDL driver ignored, while elites live lavishly on political funds, that is when the social contract begins to break down. But there is something even more insidious happening. It's about how we consume and understand justice itself. Justice has become a brand. It's a media product, shaped more by headlines and narratives than by actual evidence. The word corruption means one thing when applied to Trump and another thing entirely when applied to Democratic officials. The standards of proof shift. The presumption of innocence is applied selectively. You can see it in how the media has covered these two stories. The Comey case, framed as a concerning example of potential government overreach, with careful language about allegations and due process. The Newsom-connected arrests, brief mentions, often buried, with heavy emphasis on the fact that Newsom himself hasn't been charged. Meanwhile, any Trump-adjacent scandal is treated as definitive proof of systemic wrongdoing. This isn't journalism. It is advocacy dressed up as reporting. And it means that Americans are consuming justice through a partisan filter where facts matter less than narrative. Can real justice even exist in that environment? Can we have shared standards of right and wrong when everything is immediately sorted into political camps? These are the questions that should haunt us. We've siloed ourselves into echo chambers. And in that fractured landscape, holding anyone accountable becomes almost impossible because accountability requires shared standards. It requires us to agree on what the rules are. But we can't even agree on basic facts anymore. So we end up with a system where outcomes depend less on what you did and more on how much political and media power you can marshal in your defense. That is not sustainable. You cannot run a country that way for long. Eventually, the contradictions become too glaring, and then things break. So what do we do? How do people of good faith respond? The first step is refusing to accept this as normal. The moment we stop being outraged by it is the moment we guarantee it will continue. The second step is demanding accountability across the board, not just for our political opponents, but for our own side too. Principles only mean something if they are applied consistently. Moments of crisis can lead to reform, or they can lead to collapse. The direction we go depends on whether enough people care enough to demand change. Truth does have a way of surfacing. The California arrests prove that. The questions around the Comey case prove that. Even when the system is bent, pressure builds, and eventually something gives. Justice may be delayed. It may be inconsistent, but it is not completely dead. Not yet. What matters now is whether we strengthen the parts of the system that still work, or whether we let cynicism win. Whether we still believe in the possibility of honest government, or whether we've given up. Because if corruption becomes normal, if we keep accepting that this is just a game where everyone cheats, then it's not just our political system that's broken. It's our shared understanding that made self-governance possible in the first place. You've earned the right to expect better. You deserve a system that actually works the way it's supposed to work. So stay engaged, stay informed. Reform is possible if enough people want it badly enough. These scandals, as discouraging as they are, prove that corruption can still be exposed. The system hasn't completely stopped functioning. It is damaged, it is biased, it is in desperate need of repair, but it is not beyond saving. Not yet. Not if we refuse to let it be.